Yeah, hi everybody. This is the review for the exam on Monday. Effectively, it's skin and bones. There's a little bit from the introductory material. I'll get to that. We start with the skin. Inevitably you start with the epidermis. We have to remember all the layers, effectively the 5 layers, and facts about them: the granulosum or stratum basal. Beg your pardon. The stratum basal, rather, the stratum spinosum, the stratum granulosum, the stratum lucidum, that clear layer that's only in thick skin comparatively, and of course, the stratum corneum, which is it stands for horny layer. It's just, the rough exterior skin where the cells have died, is basically the way to look at it. So, in general, little facts about them. The spinosum is interesting because the cells are sort of pointy and spiny, but the reality is, okay, that the desmosomes are holding the cells in place, and that really, that's the two thoughts with regard to the illusion of this so-called spiny layer. The desmosomes holding on to each other firmly, because remember, it's a rather relatively sturdy layer, or this is just something that's sort of an illusion from the preservation and staining. Either one of those could be acceptable. You can see the melanin granules that are in it. That's just, the little dots. If you look at the slides, or if you look at the illustrations that accompany a PowerPoint sequence, you'll see all of that stuff that are there. The basal, the base layer, that's the germinative layer, remember, is very actively mitotic, and effectively it's being pushed away from the base. So the new cells are effectively growing away, not growing under. I beg your pardon. The new cells are being, the existing cells rather, are being pushed away from the base. It's almost as the new cells are growing underneath. And so the existing cells are being pushed farther and farther away. Again, the illusion, like building a wall, but lifting up the wall every time and putting another layer of stone or bricks down, if you're doing it that way. And again, the lucidum is only in thick skin, typically palm soles, maybe the small of the back. The granulosum, very significant because two things: the nucleus begins to flatten out. It's still present, okay, and which indicates that's really the last living layer of the cells, and those keratohyalin granules begin to appear in the cytoplasm, and they're going to be the precursor to the keratin that develops. There. And then finally you get to those, depending on the author, 20 to 40 layers in the stratum corneum that have shed their nuclei completely. They're basically just flattened packages of keratin. And again, we name any of the layers for the outermost strata. That's why we call it stratified squamous, because they've already flattened out in that regard. All the melanin has been carried up longer. It's interesting. Melanocytes, we have a lot of mistaken things about melanocytes. We all have approximately the same amount. There's some variation, probably 10 to 25%, genetically speaking, and that probably does play a role with regard to some aspects of our pigmentation, but the degree of pigmentation, for the most part, is related much more about melanocyte activity than the number of melanocytes. It's sort of a mistaken notion about that. I do like to clarify when I'm talking about that. Again, you have to understand that the big player in all of this, from structural stability to the integrity of the skin to the so resistant to being damaged, is the keratin, that wonderful structural protein. When it gives skin that additional layer of waterproofing, so to speak, as though you were taking something and painting a waterproofing agent upon it, is really the phospholipid membrane containers. So effectively, you've got a bunch of protein surrounded by membrane, almost. So it's almost like you put a layer of wax. In the old days, we'd have wood and we put a layer of wax on it because it was awfully slippery. So I think all those things are noteworthy, because that's when we explore the epidermis. As we go into the dermis, understand it's a double layer. There's two distinct layers: the superficial one maybe about 20-25% of the width, and the remaining 75-80% of the width is the deep dermis. Okay, so one is luciferial connective tissue underlying every epidermis, underlying every epidermal layer of any type. Okay. For that matter, underlying any type of epithelial tissue, you're always going to find luciferial connective tissue. That's how it derives its nutrition, its blood supply, its nerve supply. All of those things come from that underlying layer. It has to have that capability. Okay. And so, what effectively it is a superficial layer of luciferial connective tissue and a considerably thicker layer of dense irregular connective tissue. That's the structural strength. That's the, if you want to use the old term, hide, because that's where we make leather from. All of that is really particularly important. And so, and those layers are really tensile strength is there. Really, the very limited amount of mitosis is going on there. Okay. There's a certain degree of variation with people, and but it's pretty consistent. I mean, let me sort of summarize it better than I'm doing so here. The big player is its tensile strength. It's really not terribly mitotic. That 80-20 relationship is very consistent rather than variation in people. And understand that that deeper layer also secures glands, hairs, etc. Those kinds of things that are in there. Okay. That dermal junction, those ridges and pegs, that's the most significant feature that's there. Okay. It's all about surface area. It's all about adequate surface area for nutrition and waste products, oxygen, etc. And that's a consistent find that we find throughout the body. And so I think you should look at all of that. To me, it's those ridges and pegs. The fancy terms we get for them is reedy ridges and reedy pegs that are there. Oops, I hit the wrong button. I'm getting there. Okay, so all the structures that are located within the dermis, think of what they are. All the hair follicle bases, all the sweat glands, all the various kinds of sophisticated special sensory structures. There's Meissner's corpuscles, there's Pacinian corpuscles, there's all of those. And they were all, you saw them if you go and review the PowerPoint that was used for that. What's interesting, and even for that matter, the ends of the little nerves, the free nerve endings, are still in the dermis. Those of you might remember those Merkel cells are epithelial cells that lay on top of the nerve ending. So that's really part of it. Remember, there's four. I forgot to mention that in the epidermis, you have four different types of cells. The keratinocytes, about 90% are keratinocytes. About again 10, 15, 20% melanocytes, but substantially keratinocytes predominate. Then you have some of those Langerhans or dendritic cells that are the ones that are sampling the environment. And then every time there's a free nerve ending, there's a Merkel cell that sits on top of it. Okay, that's sort of a unique special sensory cell designed for light touch. There's three agents that produce pigmentation. It's not all about melanin. There's a certain amount of hemoglobin. I demonstrated that, like with fingernails and fingertips. There's also carotene, which you see more in thicker skin, palms and soles particularly. Okay. And again, melanin certainly predominates. The notion that someone of Asian descent, with that sort of yellowish tinge to skin is related to carotene. Even though there is some, certainly the melanin is a predominant agent. There are just different kinds of melanin and different kinds of genetic arrangements of it that produce different skin tones in varying races. Not that it makes any difference in the world. Okay. I do a lot, and a lot of my tests with anatomy are describing what I call analogous or homologous structures. When we talk about the reproductive system, ovaries and testes, basically they're where we actively meiosis and produce germinative cells. That's an example of something. And so when you're talking about analogous or similar structures, okay, the dead portion of the hair is the hair shaft. The dead portion of the nail is called the nail plate. Okay, those are things that where it grows is called the matrix on the nail, where you can look at the root or the hair follicle as being effectively whatever terminology is where growth or the actively mitotic areas are. Those are the kinds of questions I tend to ask. I mean, other things are somewhat unique about it. Uh, the in nails you have the luneal or lunula, depending on, it doesn't matter whether it's an E or an A at the end. I've seen them both. That's this little moon-shaped area. Just look at your own nails, your own fingernails. You'll be able to see that. In toes, that's probably the area where the matrix is located. The matrix is definitely, in the most proximal portion, just covered by the cuticle. That's there. That's the area for growth. Mhm. Those are just typical things to remember. Okay. Remember the erector pili muscle. I think that's important. Again, and in here, it's a little bit different when we talk about hair color. It's all melanin. There are just a variety of different kinds of melanins based on their chemical characteristics, without remembering all the particular names that are there. When we think about somebody with gray hair or white hair, okay, effectively, there's still melanin is in a question of how much air is in there. What's there? So it's a combination of the amount of melanin that's available and the amount of air content. Okay, that's typically what we see in there, rather than a total absence of melanin per se, which I think is somewhat of a misunderstanding. Okay. And again, it's hard to everybody. Some people their hair very rarely gets gray. Some people it gets prematurely gray or white, whatever. There's a lot of variations. Oh, I forgot about hairs. There's several different. There's actually three classic classifications of hairs. When you and I, when we go to get a haircut, it's called terminal hair that grows. Okay. When we hear about vellus, that's very fine, almost hairs that have minimal, if any, pigmentation to speak of. We see them in children. Women frequently have them. So, it's almost their hairs are present. You can feel them, but they're really not that very much. Those are called vellus hairs. They really don't grow remarkably, not to the point you ever would have to cut them or anything else. And the interesting thing are lanugo. Lanugo is like a layer of almost like a membrane with hair from it. We see it in not all, but uh, you know, at least a percentage of newborns, and it's shed almost immediately after birth. If it's not, it's kind of very distressing for parents and that kind of thing, because it's really very disconcerting, so to speak, for them to look at a baby and all this hair that's there. But again, the three types: terminal, vellus, and lanugo. And the marvel of skin is it's such a wonderful barrier. It has, I mean, the oils, okay, the saltiness of the perspiration, all of those retard bacteria. It's a very unfriendly area. The secretions have antibodies and antibacterial elements. It's relatively harsh. The very nature of skin, as it's so firmly held together, it's physically a significant boundary. And biologically, what's sitting on top of all of your skin all the time? A ton of microorganisms, principally bacteria, that are there, and they cover up potential sites for invaders. So it's a physical, it's a chemical, it's a biological barrier. And again, we're familiar with the activities of skin that are so important homeostatically, perspiration, uh, basically achieve perspiration by evaporation. It's a cooling mechanism. It's an endocrine gland because of its ability to produce, basically to interact with the sunlight in activating one aspect of vitamin D, which we know is so essential for calcium. That comes later. It's an exocrine gland because of secretions alone. Perspiration alone would make it an exocrine gland. Okay. So exocrine utilizes a duct. Endocrine goes directly into the bloodstream. So the vitamin D is activated, goes into the bloodstream. Perspiration, sebaceous for oils would be the exocrine part. The endocrine would be the vitamin D part. Oh, and again, I forgot to mention about melanin. It's so important. It really is. It's the part we have to watch. We don't treat our skin very nicely. A lot of people, because there's such an emphasis on tanning and things like that, and then on top of it, people going out and using a lot of the chemicals they begin to use on their skin, for how much sun protection are. They're not that nice to you either. If you really want to look into it, I'm not going to play dermatologist or anything with cosmetics, but be careful. What does it do? Remember what the melanin does. The melanin helps to absorb ultraviolet light, and that's why it's enhanced with tanning. That's the good news, if you like it from a cosmetic standpoint, but it's also protective in nature. Okay, so that layer of pigmentation is important, but the melanin has a limited capacity to absorb that, and ultraviolet light, whether you know it or you should from micro, is a mutagen. It's going to cause problems. Remember those thymine dimers? Okay. Those are significant. We'll hear more about them again, I'm sure, down the road. Which brings us more to the topic of and what they lead to when there's an overabundance of exposure, and this is surely the major culprit, okay, is carcinomas. Again, skin cancer is the most common kind of cancers. There are three types: the basal, which is by far and away the most common, and thankfully the easiest one from a standpoint of prognosis, because all you have to do is excise it. It doesn't require radiation therapy or chemotherapy. I mean, depending on the extent of it, it can be the cosmetic aspect of it can be considerable because of the where it's located and how much you have to excise around it. Okay, and the basal cell carcinoma is different because it's stratum basal. Squamous cell carcinoma is a stratum spinosum. Interestingly, that is a more problematic cancer, even though we're not talking about ones that are fatal cancers necessarily. But the big concern with regard to those cancers is that does require aftercare. So typically you're dealing with radiation. I mean, then you have all the complications that are associated with aftercare that are there. So they differ, the strata that they're in and the treatment that they require. Those are the big things. It's unfortunately, we are all somewhat predisposed to it, depending on typically how much sunlight, because typically they are in exposed areas. And the one you certainly do not want to have is malignant melanoma. We just say melanoma; they're all malignant. That's the melanocyte cancer. Pardon me. Getting a drink. I'm doing this dictation, 7:30 in the morning. That is by far the worst, and the prognosis is based on its depth. I don't think I emphasized this in class. Okay, there's lots of different things. So the melanoma is by far and away, and it's even though size is important, depth is the critical piece. And basically, when you make a diagnosis to determine what sort of course you have to take treating anything, you look at the depth of it. I mean, if it's all the way down into the fatty, into the subcutaneous tissue, that's ominous. That person's going to have there's a very poor, what we call 2-year survival rate. Probably more than half those people die. By that time, it's probably already spread and metastasized. So early identification and treatment is so important with these things. What do we look for? Pigmented lesions, most of us have them. You look for changes. Do they change in size, shape, color, texture? Anything but the only thing that's really normal is a hair growing out of it, because hairs grow out of skin all the time, doesn't matter. Bumps or irregularities, variations in colors, irregular borders, asymmetry of any type, spreading. I mean, all of those features. And that's the kind of thing which you have to keep an eye on. And depending on where you're located on your skin, you may have to have somebody else in your family keep an eye on them for you, because sometimes they're not as visible. And certainly if there's a family history, that's when you should really be checked by a dermatologist periodically. Don't forget the rule of nines. I'm not going to go into it. Review the presentation I did on that with regard to burns, where they're located. Remember how many nines there are and what parts of the bodies they are. I'm not going to go into it, but that's important. There's a question on it. And the same thing with burns. We classify them now as partial thickness and full thickness burns. But I don't mind using the first, second, and third degree either, because that's common parlance. Partial thickness burns are first and second. All it means is they don't enter the deep dermis. Okay, and partial thickness burns will heal. They may leave some discoloration initially, but they're going to heal without scar tissue. So if it just affects the epidermis, that's what we call first degree. If the burn, and burns, understand the word burn is a thermal injury. It can be hot, it can be cold, it can be electrical, it can be chemical. Understand it's a thermal injury, thermal decomposition of that particular layer. So first degree is epidermis. If it gets into the dermis, it breaches the dermal epidermal junction. That's critical because that's where fluid comes from. That's a second degree burn. Still partial thickness, but if you have a sufficient amount, as you saw in that PowerPoint that I reviewed, a significant amount of partial thickness injuries of rather second degree burns, and that can be the criteria to go to a burn center because of the first big problem with burns, fluid and electrolyte loss, and the second big problem with burns that would have to be treated because of that, infection. Okay, so all of that. So, but the third degree or full thickness burn, okay, is characterized by tissue underneath it, necrosis of tissue. That burn is so severe, it's going to compromise nerves, major sensory structures, hair roots. If it's sufficiently deep, it may even cause the underlying subcutaneous tissue to be affected. It's a mess. The fancy word we get for death of tissue is called necrosis. Depending on, in this case, the burn would be the source of the necrosis. You're going to hear about things like, I talked about it a little bit in bone. In passing, it's called avascular necrosis. I was talking about Bo Jackson and the head of the femur. Okay, boom, that's called avascular necrosis, lack of blood supply leading to death of tissue. Important word to remember going forward. And so, interesting ways that we deal with burn skin is just comfort food for bacteria. There's no other way to describe it, particularly something called Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which you work with in the lab, so you have to debride it. You get rid of it. And they use topical methods and, if necessary, oral antibiotics. There's a difference between a grease burn and a non-grease burn. A burn that has a fatty component spreads. In the old days, it was dumb. Okay, people used to put butter on a burn. Oh, put butter on it, make it feel better. It turned a typical steam burn that you might get in the kitchen. Okay, from going, but you're something with boiling water against something out of the micro, and turn it into a grease burn. So you ice, cold water. That's what you do. That's how you deal with burns. Obviously, the flip side of that, if it's a thermal injury burn on the freezing side, you have to get warm water. You should probably not do it so abruptly to go from steaming hot to an area that potentially has frostbite, but you should start to get into water and gradually warm up the water if you don't know what to do. And again, understand that it's very important to look at the blood supply in fingers and toes. That whole idea of the hemoglobin is that great window to looking at circulation. So it should always be present. They should blanch when you squeeze them. That means turn white and immediately pink up. Okay. And again, with burn centers, remember the criteria I talked about with burn centers. Not so much just the rule of nines, but particularly when it affects facial areas, extremities, fingers and toes, genital areas. That's almost immediately slammed dunk. And with children, very, very frequently, it's pretty easy because there's much more involved in the difficulty, let's say, of treating children with burns. So there's a lot of criteria for burn centers, so it would stand you well to review them. And that's really about the first half of this test is all burns. And then we get into bones. Okay. Things you have to see. So bones are interesting. And the first thing they're going to tell you about cartilage and bones is the lacunae. The little house for the cell. Again, it's a microscopic finding. It makes them identifiable. I understand that. And so that's the way I would frame it. As a characteristic microscopic finding is lacuna. And you'll see it in bone and in cartilaginous tissue. And again, understanding what's going on inside that area of that microscope, what's happening on a cellular basis and on a molecular basis is much more important. The distinction between cortical and cancellous bone is so important. That's the cortical, strong outer exterior bone, and the cancellous, although very, very strong, that's more of that honeycomb of little plates and things like that. And cortical bone, and like all bone, has one fiber, collagen. Okay. That's it. Now, understand within the marrow, you understand the marrow itself is not part of the bone. The marrow is probably more circulatory tissue. We will do see with marrow, you do see some reticular fibers, but classically they are not associated with bone. Collagen, because collagen is in cartilage, in hyaline cartilage, which effectively nearly all bone comes from. It is what we see, just collagen fibers, not reticulin and elastic fibers in the true composition of bone. So I want to make sure that is particularly clear. Again, hyaline cartilage is the big player. It's glistening, it's white, it's flexible, it's resilient. Okay. And so understand when we start looking at structures of long bones, what we have. Okay. So what you're going to be able to see, and it's hard to describe it. Okay. For instance, a long bone, the structure has got mostly cortical bone and a little bit of cancellous bone surrounding the bone marrow, and the cancellous bone certainly in the epiphyses that are there. Okay, if you're talking about, how should I say it? If you're talking about that intramembranous bone, then it's that sort of sandwich with cortical bones sandwiching cancellous bone. So it's a little bit different. But the long bone is really the one we study for the effects on bone. The vast majority of the cancellous bone is in the epiphyses and maybe a little bit bordering along in the bone marrow. That's there. Okay. So when we're dealing with the healing of bone or the appearance of bone, and we talk a little bit about that with vis-a-vis fractures, one of the areas that's important to take a look at it, and this is from all my experience over the years of working with bone, the critical piece is the periosteum. I went into it in depth in lecture. And what effectively I said was that it's so important to preserve the periosteum. The vast amount of bone healing, the continual bone remodeling, doesn't come from the endosteum, the delicate lining on the interior of bone, but it comes from the periosteum and the exterior, as well as all the pain that's associated when you break a bone, all that. So it's so terribly important. I can't underscore enough the importance of periosteum. I mean, that's where the replacement tissue comes from. That holds the bone. When this fluid collects under it and begins to tear it away from bone, it's extraordinarily painful. You understand most of your studies should be directed at something called the osteon. The osteon is the main structural unit, okay, and basically the principal functioning unit of cortical bone. Another name for cortical bone, if you don't recall, is compact bone. We have spongy and cancellous and cortical and compact. The terms are used interchangeably, cortical for compact and cancellous and spongy, and the same two in questions that are present. So that osteon, remember, it's one of those, it's one of many of those little pillars that effectively create that extraordinarily strong outer section, or the more superficial segment of the long bone that's there. Depending on how you look, it's hard to use directionally because it depends what the bone is in the anatomical position. So all of those wonderful tiny pillars that are just held together by additional bony material. Remember, so it's that lamellae or layered of bone, the cortical bone. When we look at it, each one of those tiny pillars, it's almost like the way I would describe it, and a lot of authors do, has that resemblance to the tiny, sort of like a tree trunk. that's there with circumferential layers of bone that are present inside that central canal. Go back and review that. That's really important. Remember, the name of the crystals are called hydroxyapatite. What happens as those layers are laid down, those osteoblasts, when we're in the osteoblast phase, are producing ground substance. That ground substance has a calcium binding protein. It attracts calcium. And so they're also producing those spiraling layers that go in opposite direction. Each layer, spiraling layers of collagen. And those binding proteins are in between the collagen layers, and that's where they attract the calcium. It's mostly calcium phosphate. There can be some calcium carbonate. There can be some magnesium phosphate. The vast majority is calcium phosphate. And the way that those crystals deposit and their appearance are called hydroxyapatite crystals. It's a very well-known name. And again, they're mostly made of calcium phosphate. There's two different channels. Actually, there's three. Okay. The main channel is the central canal. That's the main central blood supply in each one of those osteons. Tangential to that, going from the periphery toward the center, horizontally, like at 90 degrees, okay, to the central canal, but pointing in towards it, okay, are called Volkmann's canals. They are additional circulation, and that's why bone heals so beautifully. It has a tremendous amount of blood supply. The canaliculi are much more circumferential. They go from side to side. So even though they're transverse in orientation, they don't run perpendicular to the central canal. They run almost surrounding it, around the circumference of it. And they're the way that the communication between the osteocytes, those projections, those cytoplasmic projections of the osteocytes, become basically, at least what we see microscopically, they become trapped in the hardening of the matrix. But the cytoplasmic projections are in contact with one another, and whether it's ionic signaling or chemical signaling, influence bone development, bone adaptations to forces, etc. And everything that, and remember, we're talking about long bone formation. It's called enchondral or endochondral bone. It just means in cartilage we make bone. Effectively, our bone comes from a cartilaginous shell. And other things that we know, and we know that it's in growing bone. We see growth plate. The growth plate, it appears to be a clear zone. It's not. It's filled with cartilage. Okay, I agree. The cartilage is in different phases, but until it starts to calcify and it's relatively minimal, it appears like a clear zone called the growth or epiphyseal plate. That disappears and becomes all bone once bone maturity is reached. And so a lot of times nowadays I think we're a little bit more advanced in our ability to discern these things, certainly with scans and things like that. But in X-rays, you have to be aware of them. I remember the X-rays I showed you in the lecture that are that. And so, and all of that has to do with the mistake of possibly misinterpreting what is an epiphyseal plate, which is a sign of growing bone, versus a fracture, which is not. A fracture is an interruption in the overall integrity of the bone. It's not a matter of degree. It doesn't have to be through and through. It doesn't have anything. Any interruption in the integrity of the bone, either by a traumatic source or by an inherent pathological force, osteoporosis, a tumor, an infection, something that weakens the bone, all of those are fractures. And typically in the young people, we see mostly traumatic-based fractures, accidents. And in older people, we see a lot more pathological fractures, like compression fractures from osteoporosis. My dog is interested in looking at the screen. Okay. So that's the definition of a fracture. Forget it has to go through the bone. Forget anything else that has to be, it just have to be in pieces. Forget any of that nonsense. It's not. You don't have to see irregularities on the skin or swelling or black and blue. Nope, doesn't come with the package. That's not a fracture. So it's very important to understand what things are and then look at the fracture healing. Remember, we have that initial period, it forms that sort of hematoma because the blood is rushing in as it begins to clot, healing factors begin, and it really starts to heal almost immediately. The first thing that forms, just the way bone starts, first it's fibrous, then it's cartilaginous. So you get this sort of fibrocartilaginous, they call the callus, and then over time, it begins to transform into a bony callus and then finally leads to union. If we review those slides, you'll see all of those. Okay. So what you're going to see, I'm just double checking. So again, that fibrocartilaginous callus is the first thing. And then eventually we're going to begin to see once that, then the bone is going to start to form. We'll get a bony callus and then subsequently bony union. Okay. And then the different categories of fractures. I think that you'll be able to see. Remember, open or closed is the single most important criteria. Closed, the skin has not been violated. Open means the skin has been violated, and the bone either is protruding from the skin or the skin is open and exposing the bone. The way I describe it is the bone is exposed to air. So another name we give to those is called compound fracture. Don't confuse that with a comminuted fracture. Comminuted, okay, means multiple fragments. So if it has more than one fracture line, by definition, it will have three or more fragments. If it has one fracture line, we look at two fragments. If it has two or more fracture lines, okay, now we have three or more fragments. That's comminuted. You can have a comminuted compound fracture. And indeed, a lot of really bad injuries, like, motor vehicle accidents, that's not an unusual occurrence. Okay. Osteoporosis is such an important area. Remember, it's not just a loss of calcium. That's a mistake that people have been told over the years. That it's a loss of all bone substance, both the mineral content and the non-mineral organic content, the matrix itself. Okay, and the reason why we talk about the mineral content, bones are mostly those calcium salts. About 65%, about 2/3 of the weight of a bone are those inorganic salts, more than you would imagine. So I think that's all important. It's there. We went over all those different layers. Remember, the area of the structural weak point in bone is clearly that zone of calcified cartilage. Clearly. So understand, remember we had the zone where it was resting and then it was hypertrophy, and all of those things. And that was sort of in the saga about how the locations of the growth plate, when I was talking about growth plate fractures. But once that cartilage starts to hypertrophy and then leads to calcification, the calcification is a sign that basically it's just getting ready to die. And therefore it's a structural weak point. And really it's the precursor to bone elongation. So do remember that. Oh, and don't forget about the osteoclasts. They're in with something called resorption bays. That's multicellular. They're really multiple macrophages that have that ruffled border and play that pivotal role, not just in osteoporosis, but bone remodeling. Remember, bone's constantly active. All that Wolff's law of bone forming to the pressures that act upon it. So don't, and classic definition is where we find those, we call them resorption bays, because where osteoclasts work is to resorb bone. They secrete those chemicals, it breaks apart the, the, the bone itself. It releases both, it allows the calcium salts and inorganic material to go into the bloodstream, and it breaks down a lot of the organic material, etc. Okay. And then take a look at some of the other bone-related diseases. Remember, osteomalacia or softening of bone. So you can have something called, that's for a lack of calcium in adults. Rickets is in children, and we really see most of the problem at the epiphyses. Okay, the bone widens from the pressure that's upon those bones, typically because we begin to see real signs of it during weight bearing. So we see a bowing, so to speak. But what happens is at the shaft, as it gets close to the epiphysis, it begins to widen out, it becomes relatively unstable, and that's typically the appearance of children at. Thankfully, we don't see it. That's Ricketts disease. Okay. And then the hormonal controls, I forgot about that. Big players, parathyroid hormone. We're going to hear about that again in endocrine. You're going to hear about that again in multiple areas because it's all about the calcium. Parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium. It's activated by low blood calcium. It works in three ways. On bone, activates the osteoclast to release calcium. With vitamin D in the gut, it works there as well to absorb calcium and increase blood calcium. It also retains calcium and the kidney, bringing it back from what we will learn is called the urinary filtrate, bringing it back into the bloodstream. That raises blood calcium. So vitamin D plays a significant role. Okay. The only one that really decreases blood levels of calcium is more active in children. Anyone else is calcitonin. Again, its role is not necessarily clear in adults, though the usage as a treatment for osteoporosis is something that's in there. As we get to what's going on in the initial chapter, the basic information. Again, what's an emergent property? Remember, we went through, and you've done that hierarchy, I am sure, before. As you build, look, obviously, as you go from protons, they don't have any identity. You put them together, protons, neutrons, and electrons. You have an atom, it has an identity. The atom has certain properties that are associated with it, but when you make a molecule out of it, all of a sudden it has something else, like sodium and chloride making a salt. Okay. When you make macromolecules, now you begin to really see classic emergent properties that are there. So when you're going into a macromolecule, you can take basically the start of visualizing things like RNA and DNA or proteins. Those are large macromolecules. And as we begin to put them into tiny things in like an organelle, a classic example would be a mitochondria. Okay. And its ability to do energy transformations. Think of all the macromolecules that compose that, or a lysosome being able to perform digestion and defensive activities. Cellularly, those are examples of emergent properties, or anytime you put a couple of tissues together and make an organ. We took some lining tissue, and I took an external lining tissue, and I took some basic cellular types and form a liver out of it. And imagine all the things it can do there. The examples of negative and positive feedback. Remember, the default is always negative feedback. Positive, effectively, at this point in time, until we get more into it, blood clotting and delivery by way of the birth canal. Okay, those are effectively what makes them positive feedback. Is once it begins to occur, we carry on the event until its conclusion, until the blood clots. Other than that, rather than making subtle adjustments and bringing it back to the set point. So a negative feedback, maybe it's a better way to explain it. So if you start to get warm, you begin to perspire immediately. That perspiration starts to cool and bring you back to your set point. The warm means you're going over whatever the desired, your body's beginning to increase in temperature. And it says, okay, I'm going to perspire. It's going to cool it off. And I'm immediately going to bring it back toward my set point. You're making subtle adjustments continuously. Positive feedback, we call it self-amplifying or cascading. Once the blood starts to clot, it clots and clots and clots until there's nothing there. And there's all the clotting factors effectively have been involved and a clot is formed. Or the same thing with the birth process. Rather than pushing the baby back in, it accelerates the process and the degree of contractions to force the baby out. Okay. So all of those, remember how things are made. That whole hierarchy is definitely worth a review. And let's see. I think the importance of what water does, what water plays with regard to its colligative properties. I think that's important to remember. You learned all about that before. Hydrogen bonds and things like that. points of vaporization, absorbing heat, all that neat stuff with water surface tension. I think that's important to remember about. Uh, Again, the different kinds of layers in bone, the circumferential and interstitial lamella. I forgot to remember what they do. The circumferential ones are surround those osteons. The interstitial ones are sort of the glue in between them, sacrificial bonds, and all of that type of stuff. Remember the blood supply to the bone, that nutrient foramen. Okay, and remember that's the major blood supply. That's in the diaphysis. You have some secondary blood supplies that go into the epiphyses. Okay, and I think that about covers it. Okay, so there's 65 questions, multiple choice, true, false, the usual deal. Like I don't think there's any matching type things. I think it's just multiple choice and true, false, et cetera, et cetera. And that does it. Thank you. Happy to be done.